For months, nobody could explain it. Every time Donald Trump stepped in front of a camera, shaking hands with world leaders, signing executive orders, waving to crowds, people kept noticing the same thing. His hands. Bruised, discolored, sometimes so bad that someone on his team was caught literally painting over them with makeup. The photos went viral. Again and again. And every single time, the internet exploded with theories. Was he sick? Was something being hidden? Was the most powerful man on the planet dealing with a health crisis that nobody was allowed to talk about? For a long time, the White House said nothing meaningful. Aides brushed it off. Supporters called it a distraction. But the bruises kept showing up, different hands, different events, different levels of severity, and the questions just kept getting louder. Then on May 29, 2026, the results of Trump's third official physical were finally released to the public. And while the report was framed as a clean bill of health, what it actually revealed, when you look at the full picture, is a story that's been building for well over a year. A story involving a president who admitted to ignoring his own doctors, a White House that carefully controls every word released about his condition, and a pattern of physical signs that have had medical professionals quietly raising eyebrows for months. So let's go through all of it. Because the bruises were just the beginning. It didn't start with one photo. It started with several, spread across different months, different countries, different high-profile moments, and each one added a new layer to the mystery. The first wave of serious attention hit when Trump was photographed during his meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron. Right there, in the middle of a formal diplomatic encounter, his right hand showed a large, dark bruise that was impossible to miss. Political photographers zoomed in. The image spread across every platform within hours. People weren't just curious, they were alarmed. This wasn't a small mark. It was the kind of bruise that makes you stop and look twice. Then it happened again. And again. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, his left hand appeared visibly bruised. At other appearances, photographers caught what looked like a flesh-toned patch, makeup, carefully applied over the bruising on his hand, as if someone had tried to conceal it before he stepped into frame. That detail, maybe more than anything else, is what really set people off. Because if it was nothing, why cover it up? Online theories started multiplying fast. The most persistent one, the one that kept circulating in medical communities and on social media alike, was that the bruising pattern was consistent with repeated insertions. People who work in healthcare were pointing at the location, the shape, the recurrence, and saying it looked less like impact bruising and more like something clinical. Others speculated about blood disorders, about treatments being administered privately, about conditions that were being actively concealed from the public. The White House stayed quiet. And when you stay quiet about something that keeps showing up in photographs, the silence itself becomes part of the story. When the White House finally addressed it, the response came not from a doctor, but from Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. Her explanation, delivered in February 2025, was simple. Trump bruises easily because he shakes hands constantly. He's a hard worker, she said. He's always on, always meeting people, always gripping and pressing flesh. The bruising was just an occupational hazard of being the most active president in modern history. Move on, nothing to see here. For some people, that was enough. For a lot of others, it wasn't even close. The problem wasn't that the handshaking explanation was impossible. Aspirin is a blood thinner and people on aspirin do bruise more easily. That part is medically accurate. The problem was the scale, the visibility, the fact that these weren't small, faint marks on someone who bumped into a doorframe. These were significant, recurring bruises on a 79-year-old man's hands that kept appearing at major public events and occasionally needed to be covered with cosmetics before he went on camera. That's not a handshaking bruise. That's something else. And then Trump himself made the explanation significantly more complicated because he decided to tell on himself. In January 2026, Trump sat down with the Wall Street Journal and, in the middle of a broader conversation about his health, casually dropped something that immediately became a headline. He told the outlet that the bruising on his hands was the result of him taking a higher dose of aspirin than his own doctors had recommended. Not because he was told to. Not because of a medical necessity. Because he's superstitious. Read that again. he said, and this is him speaking directly. They say aspirin is good for thinning out the blood, and I don't want thick blood pouring through my heart. I want nice, thin blood pouring through my heart. Does that make sense? He then acknowledged that he was going beyond what his physicians had advised, essentially admitting he was self-medicating at a level his medical team had not signed off on. Now, on one hand, this does technically support the official story. Aspirin thins the blood. Thinner blood leads to easier bruising. More aspirin means more bruising. Medically, that chain makes sense. But the fact that a sitting president is openly admitting to exceeding his prescribed dosage of a cardiovascular drug because of superstition, that raised a different set of questions entirely. Questions about judgment, about the relationship between Trump and his medical team, about whether the people responsible for keeping him healthy actually have the authority to do that job. Doctors didn't stay silent on this one either. Medical professionals publicly flagged excess aspirin use as a genuine risk, particularly for someone of Trump's age. Increased bleeding risk, gastrointestinal complications, the potential for more serious internal issues if something went wrong. Trump's response to all of that, essentially, was a shrug. But what did his official physician actually say when the full physical report came out? On May 26, 2026, Trump underwent his third comprehensive official physical at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. The examination was conducted by the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force and included a full review of laboratory tests and diagnostic studies. 2 days later, on May 29th, Trump posted on Truth Social that the exam had gone perfectly before the official results had even been released to the press. When the report did come out, his physician, Captain Sean Barbabella, addressed the bruising directly. His finding: the marks were consistent with minor soft tissue irritation related to frequent handshaking in the setting of aspirin use for cardiovascular prevention. He described it as a common and benign effect of aspirin therapy and confirmed that no suspicious lesions or concerning growths had been identified.
Clean.
Straightforward. Case closed, according to the official record. But there are a few things worth sitting with here. Barbabella's explanation essentially merged two previous explanations, the handshaking story from Levitt and the aspirin admission from Trump himself, into a single clinical-sounding conclusion. It didn't address the self-medicating above recommended dosage. It didn't comment on the makeup application. It gave a medically plausible answer that happened to align perfectly with everything the White House had already said and left very little room for follow-up. Trump himself, in a separate moment that didn't get nearly enough attention, said he slightly regretted getting a cardiovascular and abdominal scan done in October 2025 because, in his words, it gave them a little ammunition. Barbabella clarified that the scan showed no abnormalities and was done specifically to rule out cardiovascular issues. But the fact that Trump framed a health examination as something that could be used against him says a great deal about how he views medical transparency in the first place. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough in coverage of presidential health. There is no legal requirement for a sitting president to release their medical records. None. It is entirely a tradition, one that has held, with varying degrees of completeness, across administrations for decades, but tradition and law are very different things. What that means in practice is that every health report released by the White House goes through a filter. The president has to approve what gets made public. The physician works within that structure. The Associated Press explicitly noted in their coverage of this report that the approval process may limit the possibility of full transparency. That's a diplomatic way of saying, we're seeing what we're allowed to see. This isn't a Trump-specific issue. Presidents across party lines have shaped, delayed, and selectively disclosed health information. But it matters more right now for a specific reason. Donald Trump, at 79 years old, is the oldest sitting president in American history. The questions being asked about his health aren't tabloid curiosity. They're legitimate questions about whether the person making decisions that affect hundreds of millions of people is fully capable of doing so. And when the mechanism for answering those questions runs entirely through the person being questioned, the system has a structural problem. The bruising story ended with an official explanation. But the official explanation came through a system specifically designed to give the president control over his own narrative. Whether that explanation is complete or whether it's simply the version that was approved, is something we genuinely cannot know from the outside. The hand bruises might be the most visually striking piece of this story, but they're not the only thing people have been watching. Since Trump was inaugurated for his second term in January 2025, an inauguration that made him the oldest president ever sworn into office, there has been a steady accumulation of moments that have kept health observers paying close attention. In the months following the inauguration, Trump was diagnosed with chronic venous insufficiency, a circulatory condition that causes swelling in the legs due to poor blood flow. It's not an uncommon condition, particularly in older individuals, but it was notable enough to require an official diagnosis and disclosure. Around the same time, videos began circulating of Trump appearing to doze off or struggle to stay alert during cabinet meetings. His team pushed back on those characterizations, but the clip spread widely and the optics were difficult to ignore. Then in March, at a Medal of Honor ceremony, one of the more formal and visible events on a president's calendar, Trump stepped out with what appeared to be a flaky rash visible on his neck. His doctor attributed it to a preventative skin treatment, which is a reasonable explanation, but it added another entry to a list that was already getting long. And then there was that October 2025 scan. The cardiovascular and abdominal imaging at Walter Reed that Trump himself admitted he regretted, specifically because of the public attention it drew. Think about what it means for a president to be reluctant to get a health scan, not because of the health implications, but because of the PR implications. The scan came back clean, according to Barbabella. But the fact that Trump's instinct was to regret transparency rather than welcome it reveals something about the dynamic at play. Individually, any one of these things could be explained away. Collectively, they form a picture of a president whose physical condition has been under sustained, quiet scrutiny, and whose team has been managing that scrutiny very carefully. There's a particular photo from this whole saga that encapsulates the problem better than any press release or official report. It's the image of Trump's hand with a visible, discolored bruise, and right next to the bruise, a patch of makeup that clearly didn't fully blend. Someone applied it. Someone looked at that bruise before he stepped out for public appearance and decided it needed to be covered. And then he went out anyway, and the cameras caught both the bruise and the cover-up. That one image, maybe more than anything his physician has written, tells you something real about the gap between what is happening and what is being presented. Not necessarily something sinister, but something managed, something curated. The image of the president literally, in this case, being carefully constructed before public consumption. Public trust in presidential health disclosures has been declining for years across administrations. Polls consistently show that significant portions of the American public believe they are not getting the full picture when it comes to their leaders' health. And in an environment where a president can post perfectly on social media before his official results are even released, where every health report requires his personal sign-off before publication, and where his physician's explanations line up almost word for word with what his press secretary said a year earlier, that skepticism is hard to dismiss as conspiracy thinking. People aren't asking whether Trump has a cold. They're asking whether a 79-year-old man who is making decisions about war, economy, diplomacy, and law is physically and cognitively equipped to do that job at full capacity. That is not a partisan question. That is a structural question about power and accountability. And right now, the only answer available comes from a system that the person being evaluated controls. So here's where we land. The official story is this: Donald Trump takes too much aspirin, shakes a lot of hands, and bruises easily as a result. His May 2026 physical came back clean. No suspicious lesions, no cardiovascular abnormalities, no cause for alarm. The president himself called it perfect. But the trail that led to that conclusion is anything but simple. It runs through months of viral photographs and public speculation, through a press secretary's talking points that turned out to be a preview of the physician's report, through a president admitting on the record that he ignores medical advice for superstitious reasons, through a transparency system that is designed, by tradition, not by law, to give the White House final say over what the public gets to know. The bruises on Donald Trump's hands may be exactly what his doctor says they are. But the story around them, the cover-ups, the contradictions, the carefully filtered disclosures, the president who regrets his own health scans, that story reveals something that no physical report can fully address. Which is this: When a leader controls his own medical narrative, the question isn't just what the report says. The question is what the report is allowed to say. And that's a question worth sitting with, long after the bruises fade.